Good morning. Good to see you all this morning. Glad that we have the opportunity to talk about this amazingly important subject, which is sharing the good news of Jesus in a world which is rapidly changing, the culture of which is very different from even 3 years ago. And how will men and women be born again? How will they be discipled? How will the church grow? How will we flourish as we look forward to that? So we'll be addressing a number of those things. Thank you for coming. I'm assured by, despite my language, you and that you will be able to understand what I'm saying. I'm tempted whenever I'm in America, particularly in the American South, to say, by the way, I'm speaking English, just in case you're not sure. Particularly as I did many years ago spend a year of my life living in Dallas, which is where I met my wife, who was nursing at Baylor at the time. I've been back many times, and I'm glad to be here, but often have entertaining conflict in terms of language use and whether we're talking about the same thing. There'll be plenty of time for interaction in the day. I spend huge amounts of my time on the interface between Christian faith and some of the silos of society. So faith and government, faith and business, faith and medicine, faith and politics, and so on. Trying to say to leaders, many of whom are not Christians, how does this book and the Christian message play into society today? When in the West, thousands, millions of leaders, strictly speaking, feel there's no place for Christian faith, and that really we are yesterday's agenda. And if you want to be really forward, progressive, people who care about people, if we're going to deal well with issues around sexuality, around issue of transgender, around issue of race, then certainly the Bible's got nothing to say about that, and really Christians are relegated to a kind of museum piece. An interesting feature of society yesterday, not much use for today. So I really want to engage that. I'll talk for a while, and then I do hope that there'll be questions, and we can share together what I hope by the end of the day will be a new passion to engage the world as it is with this wonderful good news. So is that okay as an agenda? And you'll please do feel free to interact with this and have questions or comments later on. That would be great. So, excuse me if I use words in an English way rather than a Texas way. Please forgive me. Please translate in your head. Remember, there are a range of differences. Two nations divided by a common language. Remember that. Remember that in Texas, in the UK, 100 miles is a long way. And in Texas, 100 years is a long time. So, just getting historical perspective, getting these perspectives are very, very different. I was once speaking at a really large gathering in Kansas, a kind of opening of a university term, big secular university, and I think the president wasn't very keen to have me. I'd been recommended by a friend of a friend, 1,000 students in the room, and he was very, very anti-British, which was unfortunate. Seeing he got a Brit standing doing the commencement address. And he just launched into this big introduction saying, here is our guest, standing here in the center of the greatest nation on earth, the United States of America, never been a country like it before. And the British Empire, once great, now finished. And really, I'm very dismissive about Britain. And I was sitting there taking it in, and then he culminated this great sort of diatribe about how bad Britain was and how great America was. Imagine I've got to stand up and speak to this group. He ends it by saying, and you guys don't even have Thanksgiving. You've got so little to be grateful for, you see. I was kind of shocked. And I stood up, I didn't really know what to say, and then a word of inspiration came to me, and I said, actually, just to correct you, Mr. President, we do have a great day of Thanksgiving in the UK. It's July the 4th. It was just a reminder, really, that there are two sides to all these discussions and so on. And someone offered me, when I first came to Texas as a single man, they would say, would you like tea? And I said, sure. And to my amazement, it came in a glass with ice. See? And I said, oh, sorry. No, I asked for tea. And they said, this is tea. And then I drank some. And it really tasted terrible to my English palate. And they said, what do you think of our tea? And I said, well, I think you've been ruining it ever since you thought the right thing to do was throw it in Boston Harbor. And that it was better cold than it is hot. So there's all sorts of cultural challenges come for a Brit in these contexts. So where are we in the world? All of us, Brits, Americans, the planet. It's fairly clear to me that the world has changed dramatically, even though we may not accept or understand it, and it has very significant implications for pastoral care, people under our control, as it were. It has implications for the Church of Jesus and the way we're structured, and it has implications for mission and the way this gospel affects this changed environment. And I think we're largely unprepared for the crises which are emerging among us. And because, I don't want to be too apocalyptic this morning, but we are in a world of deep damage and serious brokenness, and how we're going to address that with the good news of Jesus. And we're not really very prepared, my experience is, as I travel around the world. I've been in the United States for about 4 days now. I'm in the first bit of a 2.5-week trip in 7 or so cities around the United States. I had a meeting on Friday in Nashville in Tennessee, and then a meeting on Saturday where I chair there's a global board that meets twice a year, and I'm the chairman of it, and I come back to chair that meeting. On Friday, I had lots of meetings and met with individuals and so on, and most of them were hotel-based, conference center-based, and then had a Friday evening meeting, and we met, and then Saturday morning, a breakfast meeting in the hotel, and then chairing the meeting. I had to leave the hotel. I got outside to the door of the hotel, and to my complete amazement, it was a blizzard of snow. Now, I just wasn't expecting snow in Nashville in March. Maybe I should have been. But I wasn't expecting it. And I was completely unprepared. I was dressed like this. I had no coat. I was just utterly unprepared for the new environment that only 24 hours before I was entirely appropriately clothed for. And it struck me as an illustration of what I'm saying again and again to leaders around the world. Because the church exists sometimes in a bubble in which we talk mainly to ourselves and we explore the institutional life of the church and reflect on all the things we should be doing, quite rightly, in terms of the programs and the events, it's not until we break out of the bubble that we see the world has changed from what we thought it was. And the way we evangelized in the 1950s and 60s and 70s simply isn't working, because we've emerged from our bubble and seen the weather change dramatically. It's no longer spring or summer for the church. It is a decided winter. And that's because the effects of secularization, which have been on a march since the middle of the 20th century, that march, the postmodernity, which has challenged the truth of whether there's something absolutely right and can be relied on, an absolute or not. All that's happened through these last 3 years, not only the pandemic but other things, has sought to increase the pace of that development. And so, for a range of reasons we'll think about, the church is being pushed further and further to the margins of society, where once it had a central place in Western society, it is increasingly marginalized. And so it's now shouting its message from the edge into the center without recognizing that it's not spring anymore, it's winter. Or to paraphrase C.S. Lewis writing in the Narnia Chronicles, you remember The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? He describes the Ice Queen, a devastating Narnia, and the description of it is it's always winter and never Christmas. And we're going to find ourselves in the West increasingly in a world in which the challenges of society are going to mean that the gods of science and technology are going to increasingly overshadow the spiritual things so many of us feel are important. Now, this day isn't all going to be a miserable, bad news day in which you leave saying, well, that guy has made me so depressed. It's not a day about depression, it's a day about realism. So that then we change our structures in order to address that change. The world's had three major changes, two of which you're very familiar with, and one will hardly have affected you, you think. Firstly, Brexit happened in the UK. By that I mean, Britain decided to leave the common market, the European Union. That may seem to you of no consequence. It hasn't affected you at all, probably. But for the first time since the Second World War, instead of European nations coming together, there has been a beginning of a fracturing and a pulling apart. And that's beginning to happen. Other nations haven't left the European community, but the strains on the edges are increasing month by month and year by year. And that means, I'm not arguing it was a good decision or a bad one, that means that the tendency for economic and political difference to end up in military difference is very severe. It's increasing. The second thing was that the pandemic hit. And what happened was, all over the Western world, no one knew what to do, but the Chinese initial response was to lock down, and we didn't know what else to do, and broadly, societies followed that pattern. And so, more than ever in the lifetime of anyone in this room, the state told the church what to do and told society what to do. Now, you might think that was a good thing. What else did they do? There was a pandemic. Or you might think it was a terrible thing. But whether it was good or bad, it was a thing. And it certainly was without precedent. Who you can be with, how far away from them you should stand, whether you can meet in public places, whether you can go to a ball game or to a cinema or to church or whatever. Society in the West was controlled in a way that had never been in all our lifetimes. Well, that has great significance. And now there's a war in Ukraine. I've been obviously heavily involved in the 2.3 million refugees who are streaming out of Ukraine and out of Russia, by the way, into a whole other section of Europe. And so these three things, Brexit under the cover, the pandemic and lockdown everywhere, and the war just beginning to create waves of panic and concern, are shaping the way people view the world in a way that wasn't the case 3 or 4 years ago. Now, I was flattered that Milford thinks that I'm a son of Issachar, which is good. It's a passage I've read a lot. Here's some verses from Joshua, and then let me talk a bit about some practical things, and then a time for questions and responses to what I say. Here's the Joshua thing. Joshua 3. I preached on this, by the way, hundreds of times, but it's never been more appropriate than now. There's a massive cultural shift taking place in the book of Joshua, isn't there? They're going from what's technically in theological terms called an amphictyonic league, that is a bunch of tribes, all loosely associated, struggling through the desert, to become a nation. And the River Jordan is the kind of transition line from tribal allegiances to nationhood. And it's a radical cultural shift. They're going to have their own territory for the first time for 40 years. And before that, they only had a little bit of land in northern Egypt, Goshen, at the say-so of the Pharaoh. So this is their own piece of land for the first time, remarkably. So, they get to the edge of the Jordan. Early in the morning, this is Joshua 3. And the Israelites set out to cross the Jordan. After 3 days, the officers went through the camp to look after them. By the way, this is a miracle, this. Because what does God say should happen to them beforehand? For those of you who are squeamish, I won't dwell on this for a long time. God said that the men should be circumcised because they hadn't got round to doing that. I can tell you this as a military strategist. Circumcising all your men before they go into battle is a bad news idea. I just thought I'd mention that as a military tactic. Generally, it's got a lot going for it if you want to fail. I don't know whether you know how fast a man can run who's just been circumcised, but I'll leave you to think about that just for a minute. And ladies, I can understand why you're smiling at that prospect. Now, he does it to make sure they're spiritually in a good place. And then they get ready to cross the Jordan. I'm going to pick out one phrase for a second, and then I'll talk about some practicalities. When you see, verse 3, the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests who are Levites carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. Now, clearly, that is a geographical reality. They've been wandering around the wilderness, and now they're going into Canaan. They're crossing the Jordan. They've never been across the Jordan at that point before. And just really adjacent to the city of Jericho. I've been on both sides of the Jordan at that point. The Jordan's pretty narrow. The Jordan's moved, actually, now from where it was in the first century and in the centuries before that, when this is written. And it was probably wider. But nevertheless, it's adjacent to one of the oldest cities on the planet, Jericho. And so they make their way across there. They've never been this way before. And as I've prayed in my conversations with a number of prime ministers and a number of leaders in government and senior business people around the world, it seems clear to me that we need to stop and pause and say, we've never been this way before. So rather than simply say, well, we used to do this and it worked, so let's do it again, to say to ourselves, we've never been this way before. And the big changes of which I've spoken are part of we've never been this way before. And so society is shifting and changing. Its foundations are being shaken in very significant ways. And the shaking of that society and foundation of society has meant that the way the gospel approaches it and addresses it must be thought through again. Because we haven't been here before. And so simply doing what we did then and assuming we can do it now, only better, is to misunderstand things. And so the danger is to say, well, if only we do what we did, but we're more efficient and more tech savvy and more internet with it and more contemporary and brighter colors and louder music and smoke machines. And by the way, I'm not mocking all that. I'm just saying, if your paradigm for winning men and women to Jesus is simply what we've done, but louder, brighter, more enthusiastic, and more techie, then it won't work. Because it's needing a whole new rethink about the way the issue is to be resolved. I'll just pause to reflect on that just for a moment. And so I believe that the world in which we are currently entering into, a post-lockdown, post-COVID, hopefully post-war in Europe world, but we're right in that at the moment, does give us enormous challenges to address, which will require serious prayer and listening to the Holy Spirit and serious acumen with our brains engaged, but also marvelous opportunities. And the weaknesses are the opportunities very, very often. Let me talk about what some of those are, and then we'll pause for a minute to reflect on some of the global challenges that there are. Any questions and discussion? Milford, could you just pass me my water a moment? Where is it? Oh, here. Yeah, great. That's fine. When the pandemic hit in March 2020, or when it became clear what it was, I started to wonder how this was going to affect me, ordinary people, every day. And so for the first 94 days of the pandemic, starting in end of February 2020, I did a video blog each day for 94 days following that. Lasted about 7 or 8 minutes each, and were viewed by some thousands of people in different contexts, trying to reflect on what was happening as it was happening, as well as now looking back more reflectively. And what I started to do was make a list of things which were harder for ordinary people in the pandemic than they were before. And these may not be entirely true in a North American context, but they were true throughout most of the world. It was harder to see a doctor face-to-face in the pandemic. Is that true here also? Because everything went online. It was harder to open a bank account because people didn't want you in the bank, they wanted you to talk to someone. And it was hard to talk to someone online because more and more people moved away from the phone and onto online. And it was hard to get the IRS on the phone because they were all working from home and because they'd moved everything online. It was hard to get your eye tested if you couldn't go and see someone to get your eyes tested because you can hardly have your eye tested on the phone or via the internet. Very, very difficult. It was hard for my daughter to get a face-to-face maternity appointment. It was hard to buy a vehicle because of showrooms being closed, and so on and so on and so on. And I started to make a list of all these things, trivial and important, that were harder for people during this period of lockdown, and some of it still on into the future. I don't know whether this happens in North America, but more and more now, the number of people answering the phone in a banking institution or an institution of any kind, I've tried to call an airline recently, calling any of those institutions, mostly they're driving you online. And that's fine if you've got a simple question that works online, but not if it doesn't. And so particularly for older people, I stopped my list, by the way, in December 2020, and I'd come up with 63 different things which were harder now than they were before the pandemic. Now, why does that matter? I've stopped making the list now. Some of those things have become easier, other things have become harder. Because life for people, individual people, isn't only crisis-driven. If your husband or wife passes away, that's a crisis that needs immediate pastoral loving care and support. If you lose your job, suddenly you're in need of significant loving arms and compassion. But there are other dangers for the human soul. And it is the danger of what we sometimes call death by 1,000 cuts. And that life just is harder because all these individual little bits are all harder to do. If it's harder to get an appointment to do this, and harder, and you're on the phone waiting for an hour to get a reply, and if it's harder to get your ears syringed because they're blocked in some way, or it's harder to resolve a problem with your central cooling or heating at home because of the way engineers aren't coming out to the house during the pandemic and so on. If all those little things are harder, of themselves they won't kill you, but what is it happening in the dust that lays on people's souls in society? And so what we've got, and all the mental health indicators in the Western world are now showing this in huge amounts, that for most people, most of life is harder than it was 3 years ago. And that healthy, young, intelligent, wealthy people have minimized that. But if you're elderly or poor or academically challenged, you can't find a workaround for those things. And so what's happened in society is that the rich and the powerful and the influential have found ways to ameliorate the pain of lockdown and COVID, and the poor and the broken have found less ways to do that. So societal divides have become more acute and worse. Now, there are lots of implications for this we can talk about during the day. The first thing I'm going to mention is pastoral. and then we'll pause, but then I want to talk about community brokenness and how we deal with some of those things, and then some of the prophetic nature of how we engage all of this. My mother is 89, and she's very, I was going to say she's got all her marbles. Do you use that expression here? You understand that means her brain's in good shape, right? Okay, good. I don't want to use an expression you wonder what I'm saying. Her brain's in good shape, but she's 89. She's 89. So she rang her bank the other day because she was a bit confused about something. She shouldn't have been. It was fairly straightforward. And the bank said, "I'm sorry, we can't help you. We only deal with that now online." Well, my mother said, "Well, what does that mean?" And they said, "Well, you just go onto your bank account and she said, "Oh, I'd never been on my bank account online." "Oh, it's very straightforward," this young man says. "You just go online, sign up for it, create a password, a username, a memorable word. There are about 4 steps in this. It's no problem. It'll be very easy." So she said, "Well, if I go and get my computer now, will you help me set it up?" Oh, he said, no, I can't do that. We have to put you through to our IT department. So my mother rang the IT department, and they said, "Oh, yeah. Very, very straightforward. Very straightforward." And mother said, "Okay, that's good." And so she opened her computer, and within 2 minutes, the IT person was getting very annoyed with my mother because she didn't know quite what to press. And in the end, she gave up in tears because she couldn't make it work. But it's very easy. But it's no problem, is it? Doesn't. So what I'm saying is, if you're not computer savvy, if you're older, if you're frailer, if you're very young, very poor, very disabled, very disadvantaged, then this wonderful, magical IT solution to everything isn't a very good one. And if COVID has driven things away from the personal and into the online, there are whole ranges of people in society for whom life is almost impossible. And I know because I'm working on a project now in the United Kingdom to try and help young people rise up and visit older people on a regular basis just to help them do computer stuff so that they can access it. So we're trying to get Christian young people as an evangelistic tool to go and visit older people in the community, many of whom have no faith, and say, "I'm here from a local church, God loves you, and I'm sure some things are a struggle. Can I help you?" And the response has been phenomenal. People are just so excited to have someone in their front door. Now, because the devil's active, guess what's happened? A few malevolent young people have pretended that they too want to help. And so young people go into homes and steal money from older people's bank accounts. So we now have to find a way to have secure access and so on. So do you see how even the best things are corrupted? The point I'm making is life's harder for just about everybody now than it was 3 years ago for these reasons and dozens of others. And so because that's true, the pastoral paradigm of the church is more important than ever. We're going to talk about mission, but the pastoral paradigm matters because Jesus is the one who wants to bring his loving compassion to the broken, to the poor, to the people finding life a struggle. In the pandemic in Britain, when it first hit, well, and all of Europe, we were told to stay at home and not go out and so on. And if you didn't need to go shopping, you shouldn't go to the supermarket, get the thing delivered to your home. Do you know what happened in the pandemic? We basically had a pandemic in which rich people sat at home while poor people delivered food to them. The divides in society. Schools were closed and lessons went online. How hard was that for a young single mother on the 10th story of a block of flats with 1 room and 3 children under 5 with 1 computer trying to give them some sort of educative experience? All that we've seen in the last 2 years, this is true, by the way, in America and in Europe, educational outcomes among the poor have drastically changed to the negative. Educational outcomes among the middle classes have been marginally diminished, but the difference is shocking. And so, into that painful world, the church has both a pastoral opportunity to love and care and to devise strategies to reach out to those who've been most damaged, and secondly, a missional opportunity to deal with people in those bits of pain. Let me just summarize one or two things about this, and then I'll pause. I don't want to just talk at you all day, and let you respond to this first section about personal pain and the change that COVID and now the war has brought. So post-lockdown, we've got damage. Life is harder. Secondly, we've got an explosion of fear. 6 months ago, when the latest survey took place in Western Europe, 20% of clergy, ministers, pastors, vicars, church leaders, 20% were having time off for stress-related conditions. 20%. Mental health cases among teenagers have, I think, multiplied by a factor of 5 during the course of the last 12 months. The Bible's message is fear not. It's the most repeated message. In the King James Version, which many of you haven't read for a long time, but I grew up on, and I haven't read for ages either, fear not appears apparently 365 times, one for every day of the year. Fear not, fear not, fear not. I'm quite encouraged by that, actually, because I need to be told every day of my life, fear not. But fear is everywhere. Fear of catching COVID. Because most governments, including yours, in order to get people to comply to the rules, use Project Fear. Even though the average age of the people dying of COVID is still in the mid-80s. And so everybody was terrified by this. It sounded like the Great Plague. And because governments had to say those things they felt in order to get people to comply, to staying at home, to wearing a mask, to doing all those other kinds of protocols which were to bring health. But you can get fear into a society quite easily. But getting fear out of a society is a much more difficult thing. I'm working with a number of nations now, not least in Africa, and we haven't even talked about the developing world yet and the problems this has all caused. I'm working with a number of nations to try and say, in what way can Jesus be so unbelievably present in the church, his church, that fear is dispelled and that we are used to bring calm and peace and healing where people are terrified. They're frightened of COVID. They're frightened now that the war's going to spill over because our media, I don't want to speak about American media, though I watch quite a lot of it from afar. The Western European media has been terrible because it is exaggerated all these things. And so now you've got the Ukraine situation. The careful reportage is so difficult to find. You've either got Putin who's about to press the nuclear button. But how would you feel about that if you already felt pretty vulnerable? You'd be terrified. And so fear levels rise. COVID brought fear. Lockdowns brought fear and alienation and an absence of support. The war. And so what we've got is people, the dust of death, 63 different things, harder to do now than before, probably far more. And then acute, not just chronic fear in the background, a grumbling, low-level fear in more of the population, but now an acute fear, more anxiety on top of that. So the church has got this amazingly significant role to bring calm and pour, what again my King James Version growing up would have said, the balm of Gilead. Doesn't that make, don't you think that guy's really old? That's what you're thinking, isn't it? If he remembers phrases like the balm of Gilead from the Old Testament. We've got to find ways to pour beautiful calming oil on a society which is both chronically afraid over 2 years and now acutely afraid for a range of other reasons. And the third personal thing, and then I'll finish on this bit and we'll just have questions and so on, is not only has it brought this kind of dusty covering of our soul, chronic and acute fear, but also into the Church of Jesus, it's brought division. And that's been true, by the way, everywhere in the world. Some churches refused to close during the pandemic, whatever they were told to do by the government. Some of them were threatened by governments, locally and nationally. Some people closed reluctantly, but closed. And some of my very tired minister friends closed gladly. But anyway, closed. But what's emerged is that the fracture in society of the way we've handled COVID is true in the church. And so there are people who think the whole thing has been utterly oversown and hysterical. And yes, maybe you should get vaccinated, maybe you shouldn't. But there are the anti-mask people and the pro-mask people. The pro-mask Christians are saying, well, if you really love each other and you're going to love with the love of Christ, then you should wear a mask and protect others, and it's really important. And if you don't do that, you're not very loving. Right, you've heard that speech. And then there's another speech over here that says, if you're a genuine Christian, what's wrong with you? You should live fearlessly and boldly and bravely. You can't be cowering forever behind a mask. Away with them. Right, see, you've heard that speech. Now, what happens when those two people are sitting next to each other in church? Okay. Now that's just a single illustration of a macro problem. That there are whole congregations who look down their noses at other congregations because they've taken a very different route. And handling difference as we emerge from the pandemic and lovingly caring for people who are Christians and who had a different view is going to be a challenge for the Church of Jesus around the world. By the way, this isn't a new thing. In the early centuries of the church, a guy called Cyprian wrote a piece, lapsi, meaning on the lapsed. Because what happened was, when persecution came before Constantine was the emperor, some Christians gave in. And they said, yeah, you're right, I'm not a Christian. And they would say, well, in my heart I still am, but just to avoid persecution, I'll say I'm not. Other Christians said, no, I'm not giving in to that decree. I am a Christian. And some of them died as a result of that statement, and others didn't die, might have been in prison, or might have been left alone. When Constantine came, an emperor, and made Christianity the sort of de facto religion of the Roman world, there was no more persecution. So all these people who'd said, yeah, I'm not Christian, now felt free to call themselves Christians, and they started coming to church. How warmly do you think they were welcomed? Answer, not at all, which is why Cyprian had to write his thing on the lapsed, saying, okay, they made a different decision and they failed, whatever, but we make different choices. And so the challenge for church leaders, and I've spoken about this to archbishops and heads of whole countries, and they're saying the challenge is, how do we get people to genuinely love each other when they've got very different views about how this thing has played out? So in our churches, from a personal and pastoral point of view, and remember, we're only talking about that at the moment, that's our focus. We've got the dust of difficulty increasing, making life chronically harder. We've got acute fear and the mental health issues that flow from that. We've got division because of the baggage of different ways of handling this. And we have into that, that's a glorious, huge challenge, but a wonderful opportunity for churches to talk about the forgiveness of Christ and the fact that Romans 5 teaches that the Holy Spirit sheds love abroad in our hearts so that we can genuinely love one another. So the question is not, do you wear a mask or don't you wear a mask? The question is, together with our different views, how can we love one another and receive emotional healing for the pain of the past so that we are equipped for the next phase, which is being the missionary people, because if the brokenness is in here, it is most certainly out there. And that link we'll talk about later. Amen. That's the end of that little, what time is it? 20 past 10. Can I take some questions, Milfred? Is that okay? And we'll intersperse it with coffee and different things and so on, and I'll get to lots of the other stuff later. I hope you found some of that helpful, interesting, stimulating. Most of you still seem awake, although that may be the coffee. Questions? Would you like to, not a time for a speech really, but just to tease out anything I may have said or anything you want to ask? Yes, sir. Are you thinking of in the developing world, or are you thinking of America and Britain and... Right. I think that I think tribalism is increasing and it is part of the problem, and I do think, as you've hinted, it often is a result of something else, a deeper thing. And so what's happened in society in the West, let's just talk about that for a minute. In Africa, by the way, tribalism is so entrenched that the idea that many African countries are democratic is significantly undermined by the fact that actually just under the surface, the real levers of power are held by old-style tribal chiefs working in different ways. That's just the reality. And that really is why it takes years to establish what one might consider liberal democracy in an African context. Because for every step forward, there's a step back as tribal leaders don't want authority to be democratized. They're perfectly happy to continue in the way they've done it in the past. In Western culture, what's happened is that polarization has created tribes and then tribes within tribes, and what that's meant is instead of, because well, basically, you know, tribalism is saying these values and this way of thinking and this group, this is our group. And these groups, it's like the old gang warfare thing, and these groups are different from us. And so the emphasis in tribalism is on difference, not on similarity. And so the way it works out in say, North American politics here in the USA is that I've been following politics in the USA for many, many years as an outsider. I've never known a time when tribal politics is so polarized here. And so if someone from a Democratic background makes a statement, however sensible the statement may be, it is automatically opposed by people in a Republican camp and vice versa. Again, I'm not arguing who's right there. I'm just saying that the tribalism works very strongly. And it emerges in political context, and it means getting work done in a political context on a kind of cross-the-aisle way is very difficult indeed. And so your previous president, Donald Trump, was, as you know, I'm not making a political comment. I don't get to vote, so you'll understand I'm not making any comments in case someone wants to stone me afterwards, and so on. The West has looked on in the last 10 years, by the way, at American politics with increased bemusement, if I may be open enough to say that. When Donald Trump stood and ran against Hillary Clinton, the broad feeling in Britain was, we can't believe these are the two best candidates from a nation of 240 million people. I'm just being honest with what the perception was. Donald Trump was clearly a polarizing figure. I love him, hate him, who knows, but was polarizing, clearly. And then the Democratic Party, New York Times, Washington Post, everybody did everything they can to be negative about everything that he said or did. And then President Biden comes to power. And President Biden has come to power largely because he wasn't Donald Trump. And so because that's true, then you just get the thing reversed. And so, you know, he gets praised by these same organs and hammered by Fox News. And so you get increased tribalism in politics. But that's, if you dig down, there's new tribalisms emerging all the time among a kind of woke agenda. And that means that it's no longer possible to have a open exchange of view. In tribalism, you have to be right and your enemy has to be wrong. And so we've got increasing tribal polarization in culture. For example, you used to be able to say, well, my view on homosexual relationships is that the Bible says it's wrong, but of course we don't want to be negative or critical, or we want to be kind and loving and accepting. You might have had that view. Now, see, that view is not allowed now. The only view that's allowed in terms of the gay agenda is 100% enthusiasm for it. If not, you're homophobic. Do you see how tribalism shifts from acceptance, love, care, isn't really allowed anymore? And that's been the whole issue of the last few years with J.K. Rowling's approach to transphobia and transgender issues. It's no longer appropriate to say, well, you know, we'd be loving and caring and so on. No. You either have to be enthusiastic and very open to multi-gender toilets and multi-gender pronouns and all. You have to be enthusiastic about that. You can't be agnostic about it. So what tribalism does is it removes the middle ground from politics, from sexual identity, from a whole range of things. And that makes society more fractious and more difficult and more painful. And that difficulty has exacerbated all these pains and problems out of COVID and everything else, because there's an already inbuilt tribal tendency in Western culture which seeks to define people who aren't you as the enemy, the other. And somehow Christians have got to find a way, this is a bigger question than this, got to find a way at the level of government and at the level of the media to help people say, we can live in a diverse society in which respect for different views is possible. Whether or not I agree with them, that's not the question. But we haven't got a society like that. It's become increasingly disrespectful of views that are not considered to be the right ones. That may not be the answer to the question, but it's a reflection on tribalism generally. If I may. Yes, at the back. Yes, sir. Sorry, the lights are bright. I can't quite see. Thank you. As far as I understand the question, making sure I think I do, we are obviously about changing people's mindsets, not to agree with us, but to agree with God's word and to agree with the Christian message and its faith. And yet some things, of course, we have to accept. Because society is the way it is, and I might not like it, but I'm prepared to accept that that is the way it is, even where I don't like it. Some battles you choose not to fight because you want to fight other battles which you can fight and win. So I think the challenge it's tragic to hear about people just saying, well, I can get it online, I don't need to know how to read, and so on. The great danger with those views is that although society is becoming increasingly technocratic and so on, we're not yet away enough from the need to do the simple educational things right. Speak, write, read, add up, and so on. And so if I just take the general principle rather than the educational illustration, yes, there are things which reluctantly Christians may decide just to accept. I don't mean agree with, I just mean not be forever shouting about and criticizing. There may be some of those. But I think we're going to need to learn in this postmodern malaise in which we find ourselves where our lines are and what we should be opposing and what we should be opposing strongly and what we're prepared to go to the stake for, what is absolutely non-negotiable and that we're going to push hard for. Now, you see, let's take the illustration in the Bible of Daniel in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel's taken into captivity, which I'm sure he didn't enjoy. He didn't want to be there. And so he's already in a situation where he's accepting some things which he really doesn't want. It's a Babylonian culture, he really doesn't want it, and yet he accepts it. He lives with that cultural milieu, which is nothing like the milieu he had in Jerusalem back home. He's 600 miles away to the east, and he hates it, I'm sure. And so he's exposed, isn't he, to a Babylonian education. 3 years, which would undoubtedly include religious education, occult myths, Babylonian gods, as well as some sort of academic stuff. And he goes through that process. But he draws the line at the meat offered to him. I don't know why he drew the line there, because maybe it was offered to idols, maybe it was horse meat, which was common in Babylon, and anathema to the Jews. I don't know. But he drew the line there. And so that's the line in which he says, I'm not doing this, and we are going to do this. And he makes a kind of prophetic stand. I think that wisdom of Daniel is going to be needed as we face cultural change post-COVID, particularly post-COVID and post-lockdown. Because we're going to have to say to ourselves, this is not what we want. We don't want this world. We don't want a world where the Ten Commandments don't matter. We don't want a world where there's massive confusion about sexual identity. We don't want all those things. But as believers of Jesus, we are in this world. So some of it we have to live with. I don't mean agree with. Please hear me on that. And yet there will come a point where we say, no. This is so fundamental that we can't agree with this. And we have to make a stand. Different Christians will draw the line in different places. We have to make a stand for the good news of Jesus and address it clearly and head on. And so I think that's going to be very, very important. And I would say that we're getting slightly away from the topic here, which is fine. I would say that as we deal with people's brokenness, their fear, their pain, all the things we mentioned, we are going to need to be exercising huge amounts of time and energy on personal repair, because the societal damage of the last 3 years has been immense. And so if we're to make fully whole, flourishing human beings, equipped and ready to be agents of the gospel out in the real world, they'll need to be repaired first. And that's why the Ephesians passage, Ephesians 4:11-13, is so significant, where it says that the work of apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, and evangelists, the fivefold ministry, their work is to, what? Equip, some of the translations say, but actually it's the word repair, and it's used of a surgeon repairing a broken bone or a fisherman repairing a net. And it's as if the Apostle Paul is saying the leader's job is to repair people from all this damage so they're ready to be mission agents out here. That's the task of leadership, particularly in a post-COVID world. Yes, sorry, there was a lady there. Well, simply to say that the world in which we now live, post-lockdown, post-COVID, has created a life which for everybody is harder than it was 3 years ago for all these accumulated simple reasons of how tough it is to get stuff done. And there's been an underlying chronic fear that we might get COVID and die, or the fear that lockdowns brought. So, for example, we are just about to unleash, it's just started actually in Europe, it's just started being measured. I haven't got the statistics for America yet. We're just about to unleash a tsunami of premature deaths from cancer because they weren't diagnosed early enough because of the focus on COVID. And so there's an underlying fear that that may be true for many, particularly middle-aged people and older, acute fear and chronic fear. And that has led to mental health issues and a genuine sense of brokenness in society as a whole. And we're talking about it at the moment in the nature of the church. And so that's going to need to be repaired. And the third area I talked about was division in the Church of Jesus, because people have responded to the pandemic in polarized ways. And it's not to do with personality. What I found strange watching American politics is that the pro-mask, pro-lockdown thing has felt very much the policy of the Democratic Party, and an anti-lockdown, anti-mask thing has felt very much the policy of the Republican Party. And in a way that's quite strange, because you'd think that there were individuals within each of those groups who felt either bold or not bold, but somehow curtailed by the party machinery, seem to respond in these two specific ways. So if you just ask someone who they voted for, that will tell you where they are in that view. It's a strange thing in terms of human behavior.